Okay, so tonight our speaker is Amanda Bertana, and she comes to us from Southern Connecticut State University, where she works as an environmental sociologist. And tonight she's going to share her research that she did in the Fiji Islands with a community that was relocated due to sea level rise. So Amanda, take it away.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. So good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here too, and especially to the Well Sanctuary. I know some of us might be having Zoom fatigue, but with that being said, I am always really excited to share this research. And I realize the more I talk about this research too, is like showing people where the Fiji Islands are. And so that's really, so I do believe that, climate change is a really big concern that affects all of us. I kind of refrain from trying to call it a crisis. I know there's like this apocalyptic narrative that emerges when talking about climate change, especially in relation to the small island developing states. And this was a theme that actually popped up frequently throughout my research when talking to islanders about climate change and some of the resistance against the narrative. And so that's something that we can talk about during the Q&A if you're interested in that. But also going along with that I think like that kind of apocalyptic and crisis narrative that has emerged with climate change really affects all of us because it creates this idea of powerlessness, that we can't do anything about it. And I firmly believe that we can do something about it, and we do see people doing things about it, especially at the local level. So today's talk, what I want to talk about is the community relocation as an adaptation to ecological degradation in the Fiji Islands. So some of the research questions that I want to discuss today is thinking about when is relocation a viable option? Because this is a really interesting dynamic to think. In the past, we have seen relocation emerge as this context of a disaster hits and now everybody is forced to move. But in this context, what it was used as a precautionary measure. And so I'm going to discuss that element of it. And then what I also want to talk about is how can relocation be used as a tool to enhance discussions about community equity and be an avenue for sustainable transformation. Now, we like to think of this again, it's like, how can we maximize and enhance all the opportunities that are embedded in adaptation? In a way, we're being given an opportunity to do things over, to think about how we want our communities to look like if relocation were to happen. And so we see in the climate change discourse that also creates this avenue where we can discuss equity in general. What does climate justice look like? Who are the communities that are being impacted the most? And then lastly, I want to discuss what are some of the barriers to relocation as an adaptation. So today, the way that this general discussion is going to go, or this talk is going to go, is I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on the general relocation discourse, because we've seen it shift throughout time from a local to more of a global context. And so one thing that's really fascinating about the relocation discussion is that it's actually, and again, this was another theme that emerged in my research, is that it's one of the oldest forms of adaptation. When communities were faced with environmental degradation, you moved because you had very limited options. And so we're kind of like repackaging this. And in the context of Fiji, which was which is essentially a nomadic society prior to colonization, people were just kind of like, well, that's what we did. And villages had these stories about their family, about their ancestors. They were like, well, we settled here after after generations. But most of the time, people did get displaced because of environmental degradation, because the environment is a dynamic system. the thing that kind of really interferes with this is this idea of private property rights, right? And then I want to give a little bit of background on Fiji's National Relocation Initiative in general, some of the uncontested principles that are discussed, but I want to focus this on a case study, 2 specific case studies. The case of Vunidogoloa, which has relocated in 2014, and Vuni Savi, which was another relocation effort, and it was a partial relocation effort. Now, some of the other themes are Narikoso, which was a 3rd village that was in the process of relocating, and some of these other themes on the bottom that I listed, because I won't go over them specifically, but if these are something that, if something stands out to you and you're interested about it, I can talk more about that during the Q&A. So really nothing's off limits. Okay, so the initial climate change discussion, relocation has had kind of a bad rap throughout history. We really saw it in the context of development projects, where communities were relocated to make way for a development project. For instance, in India, dams, the building of dams for hydropower. That has been a huge issue. We see throughout the world concern about governments or corporations wanting to have access to minerals, and so communities are displaced and for different development measures. And then again, as I said earlier, we saw it as a reactionary guide, as a reactionary response to a disaster. So a disaster comes and the communities have 2 options. You either rebuild if you can, or you move. Now this was really dominant. Something that we kind of overlook is that Hurricane Katrina, post-Hurricane Katrina, you had approximately 25,000 to 40,000 families who made Houston their home. And then Harvey hit. So you actually had like this double movement of these communities of households that had relocated and then are facing another disaster and have to leave again. But now in the context of Fiji, we've seen a shift in this discussion from the local level to the global level. Because again, in the US, what Katrina showed us is that households, so we're not having whole communities, but we're having individual households who have to bear the brunt, the financial burden of moving, but they can move to within the US, right? And so once the discussion really emerged in the South Pacific, and it was Australia and New Zealand that really kind of generated the discussion, because the big concern in the global context was kind of more of a xenophobic feel of, oh my gosh, we have these communities throughout the world who are going to be from less developed countries predominantly, because we know that those that are most susceptible to the impacts of climate change are, are economically and geographically vulnerable. But the justice component comes in is that these are also the communities that are least responsible for carbon emissions. So in the global context, Australia and New Zealand were thinking, oh, well, we have our small island developing neighbors, and they are at risk of being engulfed by the ocean. Now, where are the islanders going to go? They're obviously going to come to Australia. This was the assumption that was going on within the political discourse. And so it generated this whole topic on, well, these are refugees. Are they going to be environmental refugees? So the discussion really generated was on a justice framework. Do we coin the term refugee, environmental refugee, as a legitimate terminology with legal rights? Now, to date, we hear this term thrown around all the time: environmental refugee, climate refugee. There is no legal backing behind it. And the impetus on that from a political stance was, well, we don't even have a lot of resources to be able to sustain are we going to create another category, and how are environmental refugees going to compare to political and religious refugees? So there was this discussion going on the political level. But then, as I dug a little bit deeper, found this kind of the gem, right? And it was this article by Carol Forboco and Heather Lazarus, The First Climate Refugees, Contesting Global Narratives of Climate Change in Tuvalu. And these down here, right here, are the Pacific climate warriors. They were saying, we are not drowning, we are fighting. And I want to say, oh my gosh, I can't recall the year, but there was, it might have been 2012, 2014, but you had a group of Pacific Islanders go in canoes and blockade all of these oil rigs in Australia. And so the idea was that Forboco and Lazarus found that Tuvaluans who are at risk of being completely submerged, who are partially in this, who are part of this, the Pacific Small Island Developing States, were saying, no, we don't want climate refugee status. We don't want to be refugees, because if you create a legal terminology that says that you can keep emitting pollution, then you will. You're going to abandon mitigation efforts, and the real injustice is that we are losing our land. And so we don't want you to give us refugee status, we want you to stop polluting so we can maintain our homeland. So became this resistance. And so this was kind of the South Pacific perspective that was missing from the refugee discourse. And so as time went on, I kind of looked a little bit deeper, and I found Vunidogoloa, and it was in like Vice News, and all these kind of alternative news sources, and it really never made huge news in like the New York Times. Now it's gaining traction, primarily because Fijian Prime Minister Bani Marama, he co-hosted the COP 23 with Bonn, Germany, right? And so Fiji has really taken a lead on a national level, on a global level, in this fight against climate change. Now, so I came across Vunidogoloa, village relocated due to climate change. Fiji is the first country in the Pacific to relocate people because of the worsening effects of climate change. This is really interesting right here, because Fiji is not the first country to relocate people. It's actually the Carteret Islands that relocated the communities back in the early 2000s. But what had happened was the Carteret Islands did a national relocation initiative, and there was approximately 10 households. And what they did was they broke up the households and they relocated the men to a neighboring island, had them get established, and then they were going to relocate the rest of the families. But there's two ideas that had happened. So one of the issues that happened was people were saying, well, is it the fact that the families are being fragmented, so the men came back home? That's one theory. And the other theory was that there was actually a little bit of tension with the host country, with the host community. And so because of that, they went back. So what distinguished Fiji from the Carteret Islanders is that these relocation initiatives have been sought through. Now, to date, Fiji has relocated these, I don't know, here, let me move this. I'm gonna move everyone, sorry. So to date, Fiji has relocated Vunidogoloa village, Kamfuli. Vuni Savi has been a partial relocation. This was funded by USAID. This was a government-led initiative. Narikoso village down here, is another one that is partially relocated. It's currently in the process. And then Denamanu village is the last village that has been relocated. However, Denamanu was relocated because of wait for it, landslides. It wasn't sea level rise. And Vuni Savi over here, which is one that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to discuss it in relation to sea level rise, but it actually had another problem of water scarcity. Because at the time of my field work in 2015, it was an El Nino year. And so that created a lot of concern where all of a sudden the village had no water. And so there was an issue with, well, if we relocate, we're building these houses, but we might actually have to move anyway because we can't live here with no water. Okay, so Fiji, what makes Fiji unique though, is one thing that I want to say is compared to its small island developing state neighbors, Fiji stands out. So it's one of 13 Pacific small island developing states. And it's the most economically developed of the small island developing states. And it is the most, it has the largest population. And it also has a mountainous terrain. So the ability for communities to relocate to higher ground is possible. Whereas we hear mostly about Tuvalu and Kiribati, the Maldives, another one. So the Maldives was the one that really the president had done, the island president. And you would have saw that he made that large statement by signing the adaptation or the Paris Agreement underwater in scuba gear. And so that was a political statement. Right? And so while these countries are more, probably you could say more geographically vulnerable and don't have that option to relocate inland. So they come across a different problem because you're thinking about how relocation is going to look if you actually have to leave your country altogether. Whereas in the Fiji Islands, these communities are able to stay within their own boundaries. So those are some distinctions to think about in how the context of a relocation is really important to keep into consideration. So to give you an idea of, this is one of the villages that I'm not going to talk about in this discussion. However, it is, I'm gonna hide this, okay. However, it is an important, it was one of the villages that I had visited. And this is Narikoso village on Ono Island. So this would happen during high tide, and it was probably, and so what you see here is this house here would flood continuously during high tide. Here's the seawall, and here is right next to the house. So what was happening in this community is the houses down below, it was the infrastructural damage that would continuously make it so families would have to bear the financial burden of always having to redo the foundation of their house. And so this was a frequent measure. And what you don't see is this would go inland. So there would probably be about 2 rows of houses. And so this kind of came in and it created these floods and these rivers throughout the village. Okay, so the Relocation Initiative was really developed during the National Climate Change Summit. And so according to the government officials that I had spoken to during the Climate Change Summit, which is a local conference that brings together community members and government officials and also international non-government organizations. And so accordingly, at this summit in 2014, a villager had got up and he said to the government officials, he said, well, you know, we have to move because we can't live where we're living anymore because the sea is continuously encroaching on our land. So we're going to move whether you like it or not, but we want to make sure that we're not getting into any issues with land boundaries, right? And this is because in Fiji, they operate on a matangali system. So if you are an indigenous Fijian person, you have access to land. Land is a birthright. And in a rural setting, you can live in a village. So approximately maybe 50% of, actually probably about 25% of the population lives within a village context. So for instance, if all of us here were part of a matangali, we would all share a plot of land and we have equal access to the land. But we can't sell it because the idea is that it's a birthright. So you preserve it for the future generations. Now, this individual was saying, well, you know, we're going to have to relocate. And so we want to ensure that like our boundaries are set up properly so we can relocate. And the government took it upon themselves to create the Relocation Initiative. They're like, well, this is becoming a reality for our people, and so we need to do something about it. And now the initial draft of the relocation guidelines was outlined in 2015. It was not yet finalized until 2019, last year. In the initial draft, they said that there must be 100% consensus coupled with proof of consensus from 90% of the community. So that means in order for a village to be relocated, everybody has to agree. Even if the family doesn't want to relocate, but the village does, then the family doesn't have to. Now, this is a little bit tricky because there are coercive mechanisms at play that really pushed individual households to relocating against their will. For instance, the government would say, the government would tell the communities, okay, if you don't want to move, you don't have to, but you're going to have to bear the brunt of the financial burden in the future. We're not going to provide you any assistance if you don't move now. So essentially the idea is now or never. Now, these two points come into conflict with the local hierarchy found throughout the Oceania. So a village in Fiji operates according to a local hierarchy where there's a chief, and the chief is the ascribed birthright. So you're the leader and you inherit that leadership. A Turanga Nakoro. Turanga Nakoro is usually a man. Now a chief can be a male or a female, however, it's usually a male. A Turanga Nakoro who acts as the liaison between the government and the community, and then male elders. Now, this is usually the decision-making entity who makes all the decisions for the community. Now, this point kind of came into conflict with this point in that there had to be 100% consensus, because it was really thinking about consensus from who. Now, if we were to make generalizations to the US and think about how relocation and consensus would work if this were happening to the US, it were happening within a US context, we could really think about, well, do you look at the household level? Is it each individual gets a vote on when to relocate, or is it that each household gets the decision? Okay, so in Vunidogoloa, the first community that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to discuss really quick this idea of where was that line being drawn. So in 2010, the Fiji Islands was hit with a Category 4 cyclone named Cyclone Tomas. And this brought up this idea of what if. Now in Vunidogoloa, everybody recalled that cyclone. It was the first big cyclone to hit the village since the 70s when Cyclone Bembe hit. And what everyone said is, you know, the rains happened and our village flooded in the middle of the night. And everybody was the village flooded during the day. Everyone was grateful that it didn't happen during the nighttime. Because if a cyclone hit and the village flooded during the night when everyone was sleeping, there could have been casualties. And so some of the themes that emerged when discussing with people, when discussing village residents, is they were lucky that it happened during the day. So concerns as to if there would be a tidal wave at night. She worried about the safety of the kids when it's bad weather. And this was a common theme with the mothers. The mothers were thinking about the kids always. Well, what if something happened? We have to watch them. Now the sea that has provided us all of these resources of food, of leisure, has kind of become a source of fear. Now this gentleman, it was an 81-year-old man. He was discussing his experience when they did the vote to relocate the community or not. And I asked him, I was like, well, did you vote to relocate? And he said yes. He had his hand up because he experienced the first flood. And the first flood was Cyclone Bembe in 1978. He did not want to die at the old site because he knew that could be a possibility if they stayed. So as an elderly man, he was recalling the experiences of Bembe, who the first casualties were the elderly. And so you see the vulnerable groups within the community were the children and the elderly because of the physical capacity to be able to leave. So in this sense, that there was a gray area, right, where the community discussed, well, yeah, we kind of always talked about relocation. We have been talking about it for the last 10 years, but then Cyclone Tomas hit, and that was when people started to take it really seriously. And so here's a visual of the old site. So now over here, this is Natewa Bay, and this is right here, the seawall that people had built. Now, seawalls like this are really common throughout a lot of the villages, and you saw that in the first photo with with Narikoso. Of people you just crush up boulder and rocks and put it along the ocean. What you can't see is actually the first row of houses, and this is what I mean where we're kind of relocating or moving is one of the original forms of adaptation, because back here there were stumps, and these are where the houses were. Oh, I don't know why I can see that. So the houses, you could see house stumps were back here, and so people had continuously moved their houses back and back and back. So the Taronga Nakoro of this specific village had actually moved his house back 3 times. So you had Natewa Bay, which is right here, and so the village would flood, but also another source of degradation that got less attention. Everyone's thinking about sea level rise, but you had riverbank erosion as well. So this is only one of the rivers or a creek that was developed from the neighboring river. And so what would happen is when the rains would come, the river would just flood, and it was taking out land. So Vunidogoloa was physically getting smaller, and that was limiting the capacity for the community to actually build their houses and maintain a structure. So you see a house over here, and so after a while, when Cyclone Tomas came, there were a number of houses that could not rebuild because the physical land was actually not there to do it. So because of that, the village shifted, and they shifted approximately 1.25 miles inland. So these are the houses, and you saw, here's something that's really interesting to keep in mind. In a traditional village structure, every house is responsible for building their own house. In the new structure, you see all the houses look the same. There's uniformity to it. Now, the community was relocated against along a highway right here. And what's fascinating is, I'm sorry, this isn't a highway. It's the main road. There's just one main road that kind of goes throughout the island. And so the idea was that the village would very specifically look like a US housing subdivision. It was meant to like spark the interest because government officials very much wanted to know that this was a government project. Now, it was important to keep in mind that from 1.25 miles inland also means that you're 1.25 miles from the sea. And the sea was the main source of protein. Now, this kind of created a little bit of issues, but I'll show you later on. Fish ponds were created down below in order to supplement people's diets. But then, of course, you know, you have ocean fish and then you have farm tilapia fish. There's kind of a no-brainer with a choice of what you would prefer in that context. So like I said, the shift was from Matangali land to Matangali land. So in this area, again, the village, they own this land already. It's their birthright. So that's something to take into consideration, that they never was any, we have to look for land. And this also made the Vunidogoloa relocation go a little bit smoother than the Vuni Savi one, is because there was an allocation of land, but land isn't always distributed evenly. The village expanded. Now, it expanded from 26 to 32 houses, and we could see how this is a pro and a con, because we also know you're consuming up at this point, you're consuming more land as well. And so you saw at the old site, people built their houses on stilts. And so essentially every house kind of looked like this. But at the new site, you had every nuclear family had received their own home. But with this, it was also this was kind of a contested area, because the new site, you had one home. Every nuclear family got a home, but it was one room. So the individuals had no control over the layout of their village or the layout of their house as they had in the past. So it created the transition to relocation and offering up government assistance also meant that the community kind of lost a little bit of autonomy within their village setting and how they chose to live, and what they were able to do with their house and with their village. They didn't necessarily have the decision-making power in this specific instance to have that idea of, well, we want our community to look a certain way as they had in the past. And so we could think about, that's another actually generalization that can be applied to a US context. If relocation were to happen, who has the ability to make the say over what your house is gonna look like and what your community is going to look like if you're being offered financial assistance from an outside entity, right? But one of the things was that the fish ponds were supposed to be a dual purpose. Now, and there was also a pineapple farm over here. And what you can't see is down the road, they were gifted some cattle. And the idea was later on down the line, Vunidogoloa might be a place for dairy farming. So the idea here was not only if we're going to let's maximize the benefits, of these relocation projects and implement income generating projects at the same time, because these are rural areas and they have little access to the market economy. So the idea here was the fish ponds would be harvested, it would be distributed, it would be a point to compensate for the subsistence fishing that took place at the old site, but any surplus could be sold to the neighbors, and then that could be filtered, that financial revenue could be filtered back into the community. Now, kind of talking about the uncontested principles and how these manifested in the relocation effort, this was a big source of tension that I want to draw out a little bit more. So in thinking about how decisions are made on in the household level, right? So I spoke to a younger woman who was probably in her 20s. I asked her, did you attend the village meeting? Now, supposedly there was a village meeting where everybody showed up and everybody took a vote. Now, I asked her, did you attend the village meeting? She responds, I wasn't invited. I asked her, were you told not to go? She responds, you're not told not to attend, but if you are not asked to attend, then you do not go. So that's just kind of how the way it was. So although this young woman did not have any grievance about not going to the village and having a say, there were concrete consequences to the women not being at the village meeting. And part of it was actually centered around food security, because the harvest from the fish ponds that was supposed to supplement people's diets didn't necessarily follow through in the way that it was intended. And there was confusion as to who is supposed to refill these fish ponds. Is it the government or is it the community? Now, the government was under the impression that the community was going to create one fish and they were going to spawn them, but the village was under the impression that the government was going to come back and replenish the fish ponds. And so since the sea is about 1.25 miles away now, again, it's a rough terrain. It's not the most accessible trail to get to. And then you're carrying equipment, and then you have to spend all day at the sea while also tending to your household duties. It actually exacerbated gender inequality, and it made women more reliant on their husbands to do the farming because they couldn't go fishing. Now, another woman was saying, in communities like these, it doesn't matter what we want. All that matters is what village leaders want. And now, again, this kind of was one of these ideas that is just the local hierarchy in place actually just contradicted the uncontested principles that the government was asking for. And so what's interesting is thinking about accountability measures. So this was kind of one of the worst kept, I call them these like really the worst kept secret, right? So villagers were divided between wanting to move and wanting to stay. I was talking to a woman and she's telling me this story. Her husband immediately interjected, everybody wanted to move. There were some people that didn't want to move. I don't know why. I don't know what's wrong with them, why they didn't want to move. And so this individual is like, no, there were some people, but it was dismissed as noise. People were trying to make trouble because the government made it clear they would not intervene unless 100% of the village agreed to relocate. Everyone did want to move, but neighboring villages were jealous that Vunidogoloa was receiving new houses and attempting to sabotage the relocation effort. So what ended up becoming this kind of secret is that the government officials that initiated the relocation were still aware that there was fractions within the communities, but nonetheless, the community was relocated. So if we're thinking about this again, kind of trying to draw on these generalizations of when people do want to leave and when people want to stay, is 100% consensus something that is, is viable, is achievable? And on top of that, what are the accountability measures in allowing people to execute their agency to stay in environmentally degraded areas? So the takeaways from Vunidogoloa are that relocation is a viable adaptation and it's implemented as a precautionary measure. Now, this kind of makes that gray area of when you actually relocate a little bit grayer, right? Because initially, too, one of the things was that movement was predicted as a failure to adapt, but now it's kind of being seen as no, it actually is an adaptation measure. But how do we switch that narrative from a reactionary to a precautionary measure? What does an equitable decision-making process look like at the local level and even at the household level? But how do you also protect people's agency to stay in ecologically degraded areas? So because this brings up a really important question, it is a taken for, or not a question, but an assumption that people will choose to move when faced with environmental changes. Now, there are numerous reasons that people did not want to relocate. In the context of Vunidogoloa, access to the sea and food was a higher priority, and that being taken away had more ramifications for the community, for the women specifically, and the children in regards to food security than did the ecological degradation. Arlie Hochschild, if any of you are familiar with her, she wrote her book, Strangers in Their Own Land. And it kind of had this narrative about, it was along the lines of, what's the matter with Kansas? Kind of idea of, why do people vote for politicians or proposals or vote in a way that clearly goes against their best interest, right? But in it, she also talks to, because she talks to people down in the Louisiana Bayou. And so when talking about relocation, I mean, in the US context, it's Louisiana that, is losing land. The last projection, it was like a football field in some areas a day. I think that's probably off though. But she's interviewing this family about their voting habits, and this side comment comes on in her book, and she goes, even in a house as beautiful as theirs, who would want to live in this bayou? And she said, she has this beautiful statement that says, they stayed, their environment left. And so it's thinking about, people will not always leave, and there's various reasons. And so this is kind of where I want to transition into Vuni Savi, because this case study of Vuni Savi really speaks to that element of the intrinsic value of place and why you would actually stay in an area that is facing severe ecological degradation. Okay, so here's Vuni Savi. This is really fascinating, talking about like justice component. Here's an aerial view of the village. What you can't see, you might be able to see it, I think it's like right down there, is this tree. Now, it's the baka tree at the coastline of Vuni Savi. And it's also known as the tree of justice. And in 2010, during Cyclone Tomas, the tree just tipped over. So I love this visual because it's like knowing that story, it's a really powerful, tangible artifact of the injustice associated with climate change that's often ignored. And again, to reiterate that injustice is that those that are most susceptible to the impacts of climate change, the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, are usually least responsible for causing it. Now, keep in mind here, this is fascinating because Vuni Savi is technically a settlement. The Relocation Initiative was sponsored not by the Fiji government, but by USAID. Now, it's a settlement, but their chief lives on this island right out here. And this island is called Taveuni. So this, we're going to get into it because this is a really fascinating story and thinking about power and decision making. So out in Taveuni is where the main chief lives of this settlement. Okay, so Vuni Savi was facing severe soil salinity. I mean, you saw, like, people would discuss the ways in which they saw the environment change. And so clearly you see that, like, you can't have any form of crops grown around the household, but you also, crabs, people could not collect crabs anymore. The crabs had migrated because of the soil salinity as well. They were getting flooded out. Now, this house actually was offered a decision to relocate, to move their house, and they chose not to. And they weren't there while I was conducting interviews, but according to the rest of the community, they did not want to relocate because they liked their house better than the housing model that USAID was offering them. So they just chose to stay by the coastline. So the Langavesi in Vuni Savi. Now, this was the reason that the community was not relocating. So the story of the Langavesi, I'm going to read to you as it was kind of translated, as it was spoken to me, not translated, it was a communication in English. But the Turanga Nakoro Vuni Savi tells me there was a war and it was coming closer to Takandrove. That's the province of Vuni Savi. If someone like the Tongans came here and they failed, then this land would belong to the Tongans. It was a tribal war. These guys here, the Tongans, went down to Madawata. The people from Madawata, not the people, but the Vu. It's a spirit. They are our protectors. The Vus from Madawata asked for help here from Takandrove. So the Takandrove Vus went and helped the Madawata people to protect them from the Tongans. To thank them, they brought this stone. This is the stone from Madawata Lambasa. They brought this to thank Takandrove. The foundation is the Langavesi. Whatever they build has to be built around the Langavesi, these big stones. So historically, the stones, Vuni Savi was at one point in time, pre-colonization, was one of the most important settlements in the Fiji Islands because of the Langavesi. So traditionally, you had the Tui Thakau. And so the Tui Thakau was one of a high-ranking warrior chief. And when the British came to colonize, they actually referred to him as the King of Bao. And Bao was like the chiefly island. So essentially they meant the king, he was translated to the King of Fiji. Now, the chief who lives on that neighboring island that I pointed out earlier says, our chief says if we move, Takandrove loses its history. So the community stayed there because they were the overseers of this stone. And the chief had plans, because the chief is the Tui Thakau, and so he still has a status, right? And traditionally, the Tui Thakau will build their structure within the Langavesi. And so this kind of has it's not conducted as much anymore as you see here, but the chief was telling the community, well, you can't move because this is like the foundation of Takandrove province. And so the Langavesi is this important, this important site throughout Fijian history. And so if they moved, then there would be nobody to oversee the Langavesi. And so the community saw themselves as the caretakers, so they had to maintain a presence there. So rather than actually relocate the village completely, they decided to shift 4 houses to higher ground. Again, so this was a USAID initiative. And with these 4 houses to higher ground, they ended up taking the 4 most vulnerable houses. Now, the 4 most vulnerable houses within this context are actually, what's really fascinating is the community got together with USAID and identified them together. And they didn't just take the ones that were most geographically vulnerable, but they took the ones that were most socially vulnerable as well. And it ended up being the 4 houses of elder communities, or it was a few 2 elder communities, and then another house where they just didn't have as many economic resources as the rest of the village. And with these, and so something to keep in mind is that Vuni Savi is actually a very young village. So there's only about 12 houses in the community itself, but within these houses, you had a lot of people who were 20 years old. And traditionally, you know, the men will, when they marry, they bring the women to their village. So the women live in the men's village, and then they will, they build their own house. So every nuclear family gets a new house. So what they ended up doing in this agreement was USAID helped them build those houses, but then the community was also in charge of dismantling their old houses for the materials, and then they would end up using those materials to build like the kitchens and the bathrooms of their own house. So it was, unlike the Vunidogoloa relocation, there was a little bit better communication that was going on where everybody was on the same page. But also what distinguished this relocation from the other one was that Vuni Savi had written documents, whereas in Vunidogoloa, it was just kind of an ad hoc project, and so there was actually no paper trail that outlined specific responsibilities. So like I said, the discussion was, rather than actually seeing it as a relocation, the Taronga Nakoro said that he described it as it's a new start. So what they ended up doing is the community themselves, they were like, okay, well, you know, that's fine. We won't relocate as a whole, but we will create village boundaries. So nobody was allowed to build their house within these boundaries. And every new house that the youth would build had to be behind behind these households in the back, behind the households that were just built. And so you saw, in this way, you saw the community actually kind of implementing their own rules that allowed them to bypass that government intervention. And there's pros and cons to that, right? So the pro is that now the community is able to actually execute the agency over what they even want their community to look like. However, they don't necessarily receive the same financial support as Vunidogoloa did. So some of the takeaways from this are, how do we adequately account for the intrinsic value of place that we lose when we're talking about climate change adaptation? This also points out that communities do have the capacity to execute local level resiliency efforts, but what are the implications for the elderly that are going to be left in ecologically degraded areas if the youth end up leaving? So it's like you see that contradiction again going on, where it's like, okay, well, we have these new starts being developed, but who's going to be left behind? And that's it. I'll leave it on this picture just because I really like that picture of the baka tree. And so I am going to leave it open for questions.
So if you have a question, again, if you want to type it in the chat box.
Yeah, and Suzanne, do you think since it's small enough group that maybe we could just like ask?
Sure, we can try that. Yeah, you can just unmute yourself.
So this is really interesting. Okay, so can everyone see the question in the chat box? Okay, so Linda said, do you think the USAID helped the decision making more egalitarian? So it's really interesting because I don't know if it's necessarily about egalitarianism, whether it was about the formation of how the relocation took place. So the USAID process was more transparent. You had somebody oversee the relocation or that shift in higher ground throughout the whole stages, and there was a consistent monitoring. So with the bureaucratic structure of the Vunidogoloa one that was sponsored by the government, you have to think about how governments function in general with these kind of projects of, okay, well, you're in a position for so many years and then you leave that position. And so if you have an organization that is kind of overseeing something from beginning to end, then you're just going to have like a streamlined more process. You know, and at this time, to be honest with you, I really had to like step back, and I was supposed to be in Fiji for 4 months and I ended up staying there for 9 because I kind of had to figure everything out. And initially I had like a lot of judgment about the Vunidogoloa process, where I was thinking, oh my gosh, like what's the intention here? Is there some like ulterior motive to, you know, to get access to land, access to people's communities, which is something that we see governments around the world do constantly, you know? So, but at the same time, when I was talking to government officials, they were always really proud of their work. Look what we did. And so I really had to like take a step back and think, okay, this isn't like this malicious project like I thought it was. There's really just this kind of like bureaucratic breakdown and this communication breakdown that occurred. And you saw the ramifications and the consequences to that structure. Does that answer your question? Okay.
If anyone else has a question, we can use the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself and ask it.
They associate a number with a memory of some kind. So to keep the
Any other questions?
I have a bazillion more questions, but I wanted to give everybody else a chance if they had any. I actually spent some time in Vanuatu. We were studying fish poisoning because so many of the villagers there rely on seafood or sea fish for their primary source of protein. We were trying to map areas where fish poisoning like ciguatera had become a problem, whereas previously, really prior to colonization and the economization of their markets, it really hadn't been a problem. And they were, you know, we were trying to figure out, are those two things connected? Is it something that's bigger regional, or is it something that's very local? Did you run into any kind of you know, ecological implications besides the sea level? Did people talk to you about, I mean, you talked about the crabs not being there because of the salty soil, but.
Right. So, no. So one of the things though that was really interesting in talking about like access to resources, actually because you brought that up, I wanna bring up Narikoso too and show you some photos of that. Because people would talk about the decline in, for instance, Bechstemer sea cucumbers are a huge commodity, right? And so there was a lot of association with individuals were saying, well, we're farming less and everybody's going to the ocean, but some people were getting like really resentful of the neighbors because they would say that, well, people are getting greedy and they're going to the fish resources and they're overfishing and they're selling it to the markets and we're not eating it, and that's a source of greed. And so all of that decline, any form of decline that people saw in sea cucumbers and crabs and fish was attributed to individual action versus like systemic issues, because it's like really the likelihood of, you know, a community of 100 people over harvesting is highly unlikely versus like what there's something else going on. And so at the National Climate Change Summit, because I didn't go to the first one where the relocation was discussed, but I went to the second one, one thing that got brought up was how climate change was impacting the fish migration with tuna specifically. But what people weren't accounting for is that there's often winners and losers. So it's not like that the fish in this context were dying, they were migrating. Their migration pattern was changing. So like Kiribati, I believe, was actually doing way better, but while Fiji was doing worse. But like that, those shifts in migration patterns and those shifts in species are attributed to the neighbors doing things rather than these like larger systemic issues.
Well, that's funny because one of the things that's happening in Maine is, in the Gulf of Maine, is because it's getting warmer, the fish that the licenses to catch are in North Carolina and South Carolina are showing up in the Gulf of Maine, and nobody has licenses to be able to catch them because they're not supposed, you know, they're not supposed to be there. So they're seeing the same thing in the Pacific for sure.
That's fascinating. Are there any other, because I kind of want to go off on a little, if you guys don't mind, I kind of want to show you Narikoso, if that's okay, because I want to talk about in Narikoso. So Dorothy asked, so was the overfishing done to supplement income for survival? No, because these are subsistence communities. And so what's really fascinating in Vunidogoloa, I had this really interesting conversation, and this brings up the discussion on relative poverty versus absolute poverty, right? And so in Vunidogoloa, one of the initiatives was each house was being supplemented with solar lights. And it was just like a couple, like 2 lights, but it allowed the kids to do homework later in the day. It allowed people's days to be longer. And then in some ways, again, you had the women who were like, well, now our day is longer so we can clean. So one of the things was, there was a college in India called Barefoot College, and they were doing this initiative through UN Women, and it was going through rural communities throughout Fiji and throughout a lot of the small island developing states, and teaching women how to become the solar engineer of the community. And so the idea was, okay, we'll teach you this, we will give you these lights. If anyone wants any more, then they have to pay for the lights. But if if you need to rework them, or if they break, we're going to train you to fix them, and then you have to charge the household. So now this is very taboo to charge households with money, because it's just, there's this idea, it's called a kere system. So it's essentially this, you pay it forward. You do a good deed for me, I don't necessarily have to give it back to you, but I do have to give it back to somebody else. So it's the way that the community operates in this kinship network. So with, I totally forgot where I was going. So with the overfishing, and so I was talking to this woman, and she had to go to, she was in India. And so I asked her, I go, well, how was your time in India? You know? And she was like, whew, India is poor. And I was like, really? Tell me more about that. And she goes, people don't have food, people don't have water, people are begging. And so and then she said, you know, and she goes, look, and we're standing there, and I mean, the village is beautiful. Fiji's beautiful. And so the woman's telling me, she was like, look, I have everything I need here. And so it's the survival idea is if you have access to food, you have access to water, your basic needs are met. And so people didn't necessarily have that same mentality. And this actually kind of created a little bit of tension in Vunidogoloa with the income generating projects, because people were very resentful of them. So the idea of like selling fish to your neighbor is just something that actually created more fighting within the community than existed before. But does that answer your question, Dorothy? I don't know what Dorothy is. Oh, because it was a private one. Are there any other questions? Okay, so if you don't mind, I'm going to go off script for a little second and kind of address something that Linda brought up. So Narikoso was actually a case of relocation gone wrong. The community down here, so that was the first photos that I had showed you where the houses were getting flooded. The community was down here, and so I'm standing up here, and so this is where the relocated site was supposed to go. But Bani Marama got access to the country, took over the country in a military coup. He was a coup leader. And so with most military leaders, but also not with just military leaders, in lesser developed countries, the military often, and we see not just lesser developed countries, even the US, where we see the Army Corps take on a lot of adaptation projects. But we have to think about like the underlying ideologies of these military structures. They have capacity, they have finances, but what is like the motivation? How are these functions, how are these systems and institutions actually being run? So Bani Marama was like, came to the community and they actually wanted to build a seawall, but there's only about 20 houses. And so they wanted to build a seawall, and he goes, no, seawall's gonna be too costly. We're gonna relocate you instead, because there were so few houses. And what they did was he brought in the military, but it's a small island that you don't even have cars on the island. And so he brought a cargo ship onto the island and ended up putting the cargo ship, docking it, and cut down the mangroves because they had to get the excavators onto the island. And then they bulldozed the mountain. And so they created these 3 bluffs without environmental assessment. But the soldiers were following direction. You want us to relocate this community, we will relocate this community. So the underlying ideology actually drove the relocation process. And what it was, okay, you are in a vulnerable geographic space, let's move you to a less vulnerable geographic space without actually thinking about how the process was done. So in this context, what ended up happening is the relocation process itself exacerbated the vulnerability of the community, because right here, you see all this. Once after these blunders were done, this bluff started to erode when rains came. And so the environmental and fisheries, the Ministry of Environment and Fisheries came in and planted vetiver grass up here, which is also an invasive species, and to curb the erosion. And then after doing that though, since this was already eroding, they cut the mangroves, and then the mangrove ended up, the mangroves actually exacerbated, the loss of them actually exacerbated the sea level rise. And then when they tried to go back to plant seedlings, the waves just kind of took them up. And so the seedlings didn't stay. And then they, the mudding from the shore, the mudding from this would muddy the coast. And so now you had all of the fish that were in the mangroves were now migrating out. And so there was actually less fish catch, and it interfered with the food system within the village because of the relocation process. But again, that was the driving idea, was how are we treating relocation in general, not just in the Fijian context, but in any context of, is it a technocratic fix where we are actually trying to enhance the resiliencies of communities socially, or are we just trying to take a community and say, okay, your area is degraded, let's move you to an area that's not degraded? So that's kind of, that was my little tangent, because Narikoso was, it was a fascinating case. But, oh, so I'm gonna, sorry for that, I'm gonna switch back because Jessica just had a question. So how did USA decide that these villages should be relocated? So that's a good question. So USAID actually worked with the country, with the Climate Change Division in Fiji, and they asked them, so, okay, what are the areas that are most vulnerable? Where should we be looking? And so it was the Fijian government that was like, here, you need to help Vuni Savi. So USAID, under the guise of the Fijian government, assisted with Vuni Savi. But what they ended up doing is Vuni Savi was pressed with two issues. Like I said, they had the water scarcity, and then they had sea level rise. And so they had the community vote. Do you want us to help you with sea level rise, or do you want us to help you with water? At that point in time, the water scarcity was actually not a huge priority. It was the sea level rise that was like the very visible priority. So you had about, I think it was 7 houses that were closest to the coast were like, help us with sea level rise. And the 5 communities were like, well, help us with water. So USAID ended up assisting them with the relocation, but then instead, or the shifting of the houses to higher ground. But in doing that, during that process, the village actually, their spring went dry, and they didn't have the piping materials to get water to the spring in the mountains. So it created, and so that was a big issue. When I had left, they still had no water. I believe I was trying to get a hold of somebody out there to see what had happened, but I believe they finally ended up getting the piping materials. But it was really interesting. Also, that brings up a really important question of, what are these like imminent threats when we're compounded with multiple environmental threats? How do you make the decision as to which one takes priority over other ones? Because in this context, it was the visibility of the shoreline erosion took precedent over the access to water, because nobody really thought that it would actually run out. Any other questions?
All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, we can wrap. Oh, let's see. Oh, Linda just has a comment. Okay. Amanda, if they think of questions later on, is there a way they can reach you to ask you?
Yeah, definitely. There's my email address, bertana@Southern Connecticut or southernct.edu. Yeah, so feel free to shoot me an email, or I don't know if if anyone wants access to these slides, you're more than happy to have them. So yeah, let me know.
I'm not sure how quickly, but at some point soon, we'll get this up on the Wells Reserve's YouTube page as well. So you'll have access to it there.
Okay.
But thank you so much. That was really fascinating story.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Hopefully Maine can learn some lessons from your study.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody. Have a good
Okay.
evening.
Have a good
Bye.
night. Bye.
Thank you.